Okay, for this mini lecture, we're going to be talking about studying infant sensory and perceptual capabilities and focusing on infant sense of vision. Your textbook talks about early sensory capacities, but I thought it would be useful to go into a little bit how we actually study these capacities early on in infancy and to talk about some special examples with regard to vision, which are pretty interesting. Okay, so now we're going to talk about infant sensory and perceptual capacities, and we're going to first differentiate between the two. So sensations involve the detection of stimuli by the sensory receptors. So what this means is it's just the sort of raw information that comes into vision, that comes into hearing. So we see in the distance a red blob, right? And perception is the interpretation of sensations in order to make them meaningful. So we sense a red blob in the distance, and as it gets closer, we start to make sense of that red blob and realize that it's a fire truck. Okay, and so perception involves making the sensation meaningful, and sensation is just the detection of that raw information in the environment. Okay, so how do we study these infant sensory capabilities? Because we can't just ask the infant, right? So researchers have had to become very creative in terms of developing methodologies to study these issues in infants. And one of the methods is referred to as the visual preference method. And basically what happens here is the examiner presents the infant with two different stimuli, and you're measuring the amount of time that the infant spends looking at each of the stimuli. And if the infant looks longer at one stimulus than another, then that gives us information. Okay, so for example, if we were to hold up two photographs, one of the infant's mother and a photograph of a woman that the infant has never seen before, what would your hypothesis be as to the looking pattern? What would happen is the infant would look longer at the mother's photo. Okay, so what does that tell us? Well, that tells us, one, that perhaps the infant has a preference for looking at mother over someone that the infant doesn't know. But the other information that it gives us is that the infant is distinguishing between the two visual stimuli, right? That the infant sees there's a difference between the two. If the infant looked equally long at both pictures, then they may not see a difference between the two. They're not distinguishing between them. And so this gives us very important information. Now, related to this method is a technique called habituation. And this is where a stimulus is presented to the infant repeatedly, and what happens is eventually the child will move from responding very strongly to the stimulus to responding very little. So for instance, if you shake a rattle near a baby's head, that child might react with a startle response, and they might make a lot of motor movement in response to that. But if you repeat the sound again and again, that motor movement and that startle response will diminish. And eventually that baby will stop responding at all. And so once they stop responding, they have become habituated to the stimuli. Okay, and then what you're interested in doing is saying, okay, so they've habituated to this stimuli. What happens if I present a different sound? So you presented the sound of a rattle. Now you present a new sound, the sound of a bell. Will the baby once again show a reaction, or do they still look as though they're habituated, right? And if they show a new reaction, again, this indicates that they have distinguished between the two stimuli. Okay, so habituation tells us that the baby can distinguish between the rattle and the bell, for instance, and also, it can tell us something about memory. So for instance, if you habituate an infant to an object, let's say, and then the next day you present that same object, if it takes them less time to habituate the second time around, that indicates that there's some memory for that particular object. So what I want you to do is just pause really quickly, and I want you to watch this clip on habituation. And so what you want to look for is this pattern of habituation where the infant stops paying attention to the stimulus, and then the dishabituation or recovery to a new object. Okay, another thing that we can use to study infant sensory capabilities is their sucking response, right? We know they have this reflex of sucking, and so we can capitalize on that and have it give us information about what infants are sensing. And what we know from using the sucking response is that infants can learn to vary their sucking pattern in response to different stimuli. So let me show you an example. Okay, some research that was conducted by DeCasper and colleagues. What they did is they had mothers read The Cat in the Hat to their fetuses, yes, their fetuses in utero during prenatal development twice a day for the last 6.5 weeks of pregnancy. And then after birth, they hooked up the newborn to this apparatus, as you can see, right, with the headphones and this device that monitors sucking rate. And what would happen is if they sped up their sucking rate, they could hear their mother's tape recorded voice reading The Cat in the Hat. If they slowed down their sucking rate, then the recording would switch to their mother reading a new story. Okay, and what they found is that the newborns, very shortly after birth, learned very quickly to keep their sucking rate at a faster rate so that they could hear their mother's tape recorded voice reading the same story. Right, so that indicates that they heard the story in utero, and that once they were born, they were able to distinguish that familiar story from a new story, and they actually preferred hearing the original story. Now, newborn sense of vision is not very good. It's actually the least developed sense at birth. And if you think about why that might be, again, they're not getting very much experience with seeing in utero. There's not a whole lot of light exposure in utero. Now, even though they're coming into the world with very poor visual acuity, by about 6 months of age, they're seeing at adult levels. So if you want to take a look, there's a link here listed under limited acuity. It's part of the Secret Life of the Brain series, and there is one of the parts of the website looks at infant vision and kind of gives you a comparison of what a newborn sees versus what an adult sees, and it really gives you an indication of how poor, how limited their acuity is. So they're not really seeing very well early on, but by about 6 months, they're seeing almost at adult levels. They are capable of tracking objects in the environment. They can track some stimuli smoothly, but their tracking is limited to objects that are very large and slow moving. And so part of it is because of the limited acuity, but also just their ability to scan is still developing. They tend to have more sort of jerky forwarding of the eyes to the next position in a rough manner, as opposed to the smooth tracking that you would see from an older child or an adult. And they're not necessarily anticipating very accurately the new location of the object that's coming up. But that smooth tracking will improve with age. So, how do we know that infants have poor acuity? Well, if you look at the picture here, again, we've had to be creative with how we measure these things with children. If we were going to test our own visual acuity, we would go to the eye doctor, and he would use the eye chart, right? Which obviously is not going to work for a newborn. But what we use is something that's similar and draws upon that visual preference method. So you see here there are two figures that are presented to the infant side by side. One is just a gray field, and the other is a pattern of bold black and white lines. Now, if the infant has very poor visual acuity and they can't see the difference between these two objects, they would look back and forth at them and look at them equally as often, right? But if you have the infant looking more at the bold black and white lines, because that's what they will prefer, they prefer objects that are more complex, then that indicates that they're distinguishing between the two, and so they're able to make out the difference. And you can alter the boldness of these lines. You can make them even more bold. You can make them very narrow and close together, and that will give you some indication of how good their vision is. Another question has to do with, perception of color. One common question is when can infants perceive color? And they can perceive color, but part of the problem is that very poor visual acuity, which you'll get a sense of when you look at that website that I pointed you to. But within the first 2 months, they're seeing color pretty well. And the way that we know this is, again, they're sort of distinguishing through the visual preference method and through habituation colors that are categorically different and perceived as categorically different by adults. Another thing to think about with regard to infant vision is some of the other preferences that they have. So I said they prefer complex objects to simple ones. They prefer symmetrical objects. They prefer objects with contours and curves. So there's lots of preferences that infants have in terms of color. They prefer objects of high contrast, with colors of very high contrast to one another. Again, because that is probably easier to see with their poor visual acuity. This is why you'll often see toys and mobiles and decorations that are black, white, and red. Designed for infants is because those colors are very much in contrast with one another. And they also finally have a preference for human faces. So we're starting to see, right, that they have this sort of human preference or social preference. They can locate their mother's breast pad, right? They can identify her by smell very early. They prefer human voices to other kinds of sounds. They prefer to look at faces in comparison to other kinds of objects. And so they seem to be coming into the world with this sort of preparation for being in tune with the social environment, which probably is very adaptive, right? And probably similar to imprinting that we talked about before, that if you are going to survive, then it is adaptive to be able to pay attention to and stay fixated on those in the environment that are going to protect you, that are going to teach you, that are going to care for you, etc. So they do have a preference for human faces. And there have been lots of studies that have looked at this. One study established that infants have this preference for faces early by 3 months. And so let me show you that example now. Okay, so in this study, they took 6-week-olds and 12-week-olds and showed them side by side figures A and B, and also showed them side by side figures C and D. So if I were to ask you which of A and B looks more like a face to you, you'd probably say that A looks more like a face. Most adults say that A looks more like a face than B does. And so the question is, would 6-week-olds and 12-week-olds look at these two images equally often, or would they prefer A to B? And then C and D are used just as a comparison, because the difference between A and B is the contrast, right? The contrast is reversed, and same with C and D. So we're trying to see, is it the contrast that they're distinguishing between, or is it the face-like pattern that they're distinguishing between? And so what they found is that at 6 weeks, infants looked at the two figures equally often. So they looked at A and B equally often, and they looked at C and D equally often. But by 12 weeks, they strongly preferred A to B. So they looked at A much longer than they looked at B, and they still made no distinction between C or D. So by 12 weeks of age, they are looking at this object that looks more like a human face. It's not a human face. It's definitely not a photograph, but it resembles a human face enough for the infant to be drawn to it. Another study was questioning whether the face really has to look like a face, like a real face, to attract their attention, or whether it can just have some of the features of a face. So could you have just two blobs approximately where the eyes would be, another blob where the mouth would be, and would that be enough to attract the infant's attention? So in this study, what they were doing was looking at newborn tracking. And tracking is done with these paddles. They kind of look like ping pong paddles, so that's what these images are. And so they had these different ping pong paddles, and they moved the paddles around to see if the infant would track them. And so you have figure A that looks more like a face. You have figure B that has just the very basic elements of a face, right? Two blobs where the eyes would be, a blob where the mouth would be. And then C and D, what that's looking at is, do the elements of the face have to be in the position and the configuration of a face, or could they be in a very strange configuration, right? So could you have just like an eyebrow positioned in a strange place and eyes positioned in a strange place, and as long as they're there, the infant will be drawn to it. So what they did is in this study they had newborns with a mean age of 53 minutes, right? So these were really newborns, less than an hour old on average. And they did find that they preferred looking at the face-like configuration of B to its inverse of C. So in comparing B and C, they definitely preferred B to C. So already they're making a distinction at 53 minutes of age. And then, of course, they preferred A to D. And if you were to have them prefer A to B, they would prefer A. So the more that looks like the face, the more that it's going to draw their attention. But it doesn't have to look exactly like a fake face. It just has to have some of the basic configuration. Now, these infants, when they were shown the stimuli that I showed you on the last slide, they still made no distinction between A and B, those two faces with just the reversed contrast color. So they didn't make a distinction there, but in terms of tracking, they did track figure B more than they tracked figure C. So that's very interesting because these are very, very, very young infants. Now, in addition to preferring faces in general, infants also show a preference for some faces over others. So infants as young as 12 to 36 hours old will prefer their mother's face to the face of a female stranger. And that is regardless if the face is presented in person, if it's presented in a photo, or in a videotape. They show this preference. Now, what's also interesting is that the infants will show an aesthetic preference. That is, they prefer attractive faces to less attractive faces. So the way that they've measured this is they've taken photographs of people and had adults rate them on attractiveness, and then they take the most attractive faces and the least attractive faces and pair them using the visual preference method. And infants as young as 3 days old will look longer at the faces that have been rated by adults as being attractive. And this is the case for faces of women of different races, faces of men, as well as women, faces of other babies, as well as adults. It holds regardless of what kind of face you're looking at. They just follow along with the rater's judgments of attractiveness. And why is this, right? Because we tend to think of attractiveness sometimes as representing sort of a societal preference, societal definitions of what attractiveness is, culture, etc. And obviously, newborns are not exposed to that, so why are they showing this preference? It could be that attractive faces just have some of the characteristics that newborns are drawn to anyway. So we know, for instance, that attractive faces tend to be more asymmetrical than less attractive ones, so perhaps it's the asymmetry that they're drawn to. However, other research has suggested that it's more complex than that. So it could be that attractive faces are the prototype for an average face. What do I mean by that? What's a prototype? Well, if I ask you to imagine an apple, probably the majority of you imagined a red apple, right? That is the prototypical example of that category for you. It's the best example of an apple for you. So perhaps an attractive face is the best example of a face. And the way that this has been researched is that you can generate a face digitally by creating an average composite of several faces. You've probably seen this done, right, where you sort of combine several different faces. And if you show the composite to adults, they will rate the composite as being very attractive. And infants will also look longer at this composite of a face, even in comparison to a single face that's rated as being highly attractive. So perhaps, they coming into the world having this social bias, this social preference. They're prepared to pay attention to other humans, and if you're going to pay attention to other humans, why not pay attention to the best example of that, right? So perhaps that's what we're seeing in terms of this aesthetic preference. More research needs to be done, but it's an interesting phenomenon.